working? If it's not, that's fine. It's just the two of us, which is what the podcast is all about anyway. How you doing, Max?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you for having me.
It's great. It's been a little while since I've had you on. I have to say, you guys at TTT have been killing it with content and podcasts. I mean, for a while now. I mean, ever since I started following you guys, or even before that. But since the games, especially, I think I've watched a lot of your podcasts, opinion pieces, and I really appreciate the critical thinking that goes into the discipline. I mean, as a whole, we know that CrossFit is not just one thing; it's many things. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Congrats on that. Have you guys shifted on that front in regards to the content or the strategy around the content, or do you guys
Yeah,
still follow a pretty organic development path on that?
yeah. We started with a very regimented process, like almost similar to training. Like, hey, we want to put out one content piece a week, one podcast a week, and at some point we found ourselves getting stagnant because we're all coaches, we're building other content, we're coaching people.
Mhm.
So sometimes we would come in and be like, I don't really want to talk today. Like, I don't want to do a podcast, but you have to do it. So the last season we took a break from doing it. Like, we went on pause, I think, from the time the open started until the end of the games. And we came back, we were like, hey, let's only talk about things that we're more excited to talk about. Like, if we have
Yeah.
ideas that we think are valuable for the community. So I think we just went from a more like volume structure driven model to a like, let's make it purposeful and let's only put stuff out that's serving the community or the sport or our business needs or our own like intellectual desire to just get things out. Sometimes I do that, especially in social media. It's just a cool thing in the world that now, if you have an idea and you put it out there, for me, I can get thousands of people's opinions back to me instantaneously to help me get out of my own echo bubble. Whereas in the past, you might just be sitting there with an idea and have to go read books and have to like, search to create a more informed opinion. Now I can make sure I get out of, I mean, it's still maybe a little bit of an echo chamber because my followers will be responding to me, but it's better than me being in this echo chamber of my own head.
It's funny that you frame it like that. That was always one of my first reasons for creating content. And to this day, like thoughts, I try to do one thought of the day on YouTube every day. I don't always succeed, but I've made it through 350, I think, so far. And that's
Nice.
actually at first I'm just talking to myself, which is fine as well because it helps me organize my thoughts. But
Yeah.
as it goes along, like you said, getting the feedback and getting essentially your ideas tested on the spot and
Yeah.
being able to reflect on it is I find it invaluable, absolutely invaluable.
Yeah. I agree.
Have you changed your perspective on any topics that you've talked about following, exchanges or feedback or comments from your community recently?
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever had like a super big hard line opinion that I put out there that has changed, but I think I've gotten more informed perspectives by putting
Mm.
my stuff out there. My experience in the CrossFit world has been pretty broad. Like, I've coached inside of an affiliate, I've set up individual coaching inside of an affiliate. I did research for a business that is in the CrossFit space, but was excommunicated by CrossFit. I've built education. I've coached games athletes. And like, I have all these broad things. And I think you can sometimes get lured into thinking like, oh, well, I know more than other people, or I have this, broad perspective. So it means more. And sometimes by putting my ideas out, if somebody's very niched into like, hey, they spent their whole career of 10 years inside the affiliate, and they've seen more affiliates and they've traveled to more affiliates, even though I have some affiliate experience, I've like been like, oh, okay, this is almost like humbling information to keep me in check and realize that I can always be better. I can always learn more, that our community is still really young and it should be getting better. So the top level people in all the little sub disciplines can probably teach me something new every single year. So I think it's just made me more intellectually humble.
I'm gonna go a little meta with this question here, and I'm gonna ask your own question back to yourself from your last Instagram post because it
Yeah.
ties in perfectly with what you just said. What makes someone an expert in CrossFit, Max?
Yeah.
Okay, wait. Let me pull it back for a second. Why did you ask the question, and then I'll let you answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I asked the question because sometimes there's It's maybe an underlying frustration about the way that market perception can be created. And in the health and wellness world, which I would kind of classify CrossFit, the sports side of it, I think it's almost easier to see that if somebody's a high level athlete and has won, or they're a high level coach and have put people there regularly and been relevant, it's kind of almost more easier to discern, like, oh, they know what they're talking about. But when it comes to physical training, to me, it's such a complicated topic. There's like human behavior, psychology, biomechanics, movement, sociology, exercise physiology, and all of these different things that come into really trying to help somebody reach their physical goals or even just become healthy. Like, well, what does the concept of health mean to you? Is it purely your body fat and whether you can do thrusters, or is it whether you're integrated into a good community? And sometimes the oversimplification of the message of educators in the CrossFit space can frustrate me, or like even the bodybuilding thing. It's like, oh, well, I'm big and I look good and I take pictures of myself, so I'm healthy. But some of those people might have huge underlying mental health issues that they're not talking about publicly that could potentially be driven by the behaviors that they have. So I was thinking about this in the discussions going back and forth with Dave Castro and CrossFit HQ and CrossFit as a sport and other people that I've been talking to in academia, and wondering if it's difficult for me as somebody that has dedicated my whole life to understand what expertise means. How difficult is it for a regular unhealthy person in the market to make an informed decision about who they should trust? And unfortunately, it's an Instagram where I posted the comment is a very image driven thing. So people's expertise is more like, well, if I look at you and you look sexy, then you know what you're talking about. And I just really wanted to kind of pose the question, because I think critical thinking in that space about who we're giving power to as an authority in the market is a much more important thing than people realize. And I think some of the cultural issues we're dealing with are related to the fact that we let people influence us, right? There's even a term, influencer, that don't really deserve to influence humanity on a broad level. They haven't thought about the issues. They haven't coached people through the issues. So it was kind of my way of just like putting something out there that made people critically think about who they're giving their money and their time and their attention to. And then also selfishly for me to figure out, well, if I want to be somebody that can influence at a bigger level, what are these people wanting? Are they wanting that? Are they curious to ask hard questions to themselves? And so it was just my kind of little thought experiment.
What did you come out of this thought experiment with? Did you get some good comments back? Did some insightful comments that resonate?
Yeah, I did. I some of the insights I got were, first, that my audience considers me an expert in some capacity. So a lot of what they said reinforced to me, like, oh, well, I am doing things that are helping me gain expertise. But then that made me challenge myself to say, well, this is my audience. And if I only have whatever, 10,000 people following me, it's probably not reflective of what the broad base of Instagram and humanity thinks is influential. So that was one kind of major learning point from it. The second was that there was somebody that asked a question or posed a comment that said, I find it strange that nobody on this list said the level 3 or the level 4 certification in CrossFit. And I was like, huh, that's really interesting. Like, their own certification body doesn't hold enough weight in the community to say that if you take that thing, you're actually even good at doing the thing. You just, I guess, whatever that means, maybe that people just check the boxes or were part of, seminar staff and they just got like donned the authority that way. But that, I just thought that was very interesting. And I thought it was an interesting thing that, even this kind of circles back to the discussion or the thing that Dave Castro had commented on when I had prodded about the high intensity just situation. I feel like the methodology of CrossFit not being very clear in terms of what is CrossFit, what isn't CrossFit, how do you do CrossFit appropriately relative to what CrossFit thinks, are there different ways to do CrossFit properly? Not having that nuanced discussion I think, because it's been such like an anti-establishment orientation for so long, now that you have an established thing, that anti-establishment undertoning and like, you know, keeping things kind of gray and murky and not trying to, you know, articulate or change the way that things are done as we gain more experience is causing real cultural problems in the community, because people that are thinking about it are fighting with people that are in it preaching it. The people that are preaching it sometimes are not actually advancing their understanding. Instead, they're like hunkering down and defending, like, no, this is our material, this is how it has to be done, this is how you have to speak it. And it's just such an interesting problem to me, because I want to help solve it. Like, I want to be one of the people that's helping move it forward, because I think underlying the ideology is something that really changed my understanding of training at a really high level. And I'm grateful to that, because if not, I probably would have just been doing bodybuilding and cardio my whole life and not learned how to move my body and stretch and apply this stuff to martial arts. And like, I've learned so much as a result of that initial spark of insight that Greg Glassman made for me.
Yeah, I think defining terms clearly and having a clear framework on how things operate is very important. One of the challenges, and I'd love your kind of your feedback on that. One of the challenges that I see with CrossFit as a whole is that there's the basic philosophy, because it's really a methodology or a philosophy at its foundation, with what Greg outlined early on.
I think it's a philosophy more than I would call it a methodology. They say
I definitely.
methodology.
No, I definitely call it a philosophy. Yeah, and for anybody who hasn't read the original like CrossFit Journal like articles, go read those, because that's really where it all started, or at least that's where the inception of the ideas come together. And there's probably only one or two things that I'm not super keen on the original papers, like let's say minor points of disagreement. But overall, I think it's a fantastic document. And what I see is it's obviously evolved and morphed, and now, at least in my mind, and I'd love to have your take on that, there's two big kind of things that have emerged from that. There's obviously the philosophy that still exists and that can still be applied to many different levels and people and for many different goals. But then there's the sport. And for me, the sport is now I'm not sure if I could say completely separate from the original philosophy itself, but it's gone so far away from it that it's really not the same thing anymore. And we cannot necessarily talk about it in those clear terms. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. But I would think that the heads of education of CrossFit would argue with me on that point. And I would love to hear what they actually think. Because when I look at it, like the CrossFit Games, especially over the course of the 10 years that Dave Castro was programming it, pretty radically deviated from properly testing according to their own definitions of fitness, right? Like it was clearly, from his background, it overemphasized cardiovascular endurance, stamina, like just the amount of volume of tests that existed. Like, they have their 3 energy system windows in their education, the short, powerful one, the medium one, and then the long one. And you would have 95% of your testing body from start to finish that existed in the medium to long range of it. And I'm like, all right, well, you already have one major flaw in the testing architecture relative to what you define. And then there would be other ones, like I think agility, balance, coordination, a lot of those skills weren't really tested. They would put novel things in, but there wouldn't be a clear, like, well, is catching a snatch really balance? Like, especially if they've practiced 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times in training, or should we have balance beams or Ninja Warrior obstacles? Sometimes they would get that in the obstacle courses, but you'd also go years where that wasn't there. So I think that a lot of the best CrossFit athletes in the world are actually not the most CrossFit or the most fit according to the definition. Now, they're freaking amazing specimens of human capacity.
Absolutely.
They have crazy volume. If you change the testing, those athletes would probably still be at the top with a good balanced subset of tests because they're freak athletes. But if you just said, we're going to test this philosophy exactly as it's written, the CrossFit Games wouldn't look like the CrossFit Games. It probably would have never grew into the CrossFit Games. And so I think that there needs to be some sort of clearer delineation or more clear education from the people at the top of CrossFit to say, what is the difference and why is there a difference? And do we need to call it a fitness test, or could we just call it a CrossFit test? And like, it doesn't need to be balanced, because a lot of times those people that are up there are like, oh, this is a proving ground for the fittest on earth. Here are our people. Here are our idols. Here are the people that are showing our methods. And I'm like, yeah, but a lot of them are not, right? Like, they're doing tons of low intensity work. They're doing tons of skill work. They have 10 years of gymnastics background where they did zero CrossFit, or Matt Frazier, who only weightlifted for 10 years. And I'm like, you can't negate somebody's whole decade of training to become precise. Then when they put it together in a format of CrossFit, say, oh, it's CrossFit that did this, or now he's PRing by doing CrossFit. I'm like, yeah, but he's also maturing into a grown man who has an incentive to, make millions of dollars. Of course, he'll be a little bit more powerful in that type of environment than like, a lower level lifter who's never going to make it and who had a back injury, who was in his teenage years. So there's like this, I don't know. There's just, I think I went off on a tangent, but I do think that there needs to be a very clear separation. I think it would almost be better if the sport wasn't owned by CrossFit, so that CrossFit could get back to being a training ideology and not have to worry about whether or not there's this contradiction between the sport and what they're doing, and stopping people from me. Like, I can't say really that I coach CrossFit. I mean, I have my level 1, but so I'm like, okay, well, do I coach functional fitness racing? It's like, it's just such a weird thing. It'd be like the NBA owning the word basketball and you not being able to say it.
And I guess it's what sticks out for me here is throughout this evolution from the philosophy into that sport plus philosophy, if we can dissociate it like that. And one of the challenges that I see in the CrossFit space now is that culturally, the philosophy was meant as general physical preparedness, right? It was your GPP for whatever sport you did, or it was a means to an end. Go explore other sports. That's why sport is at the top of the pyramid. But now that for the competitors in the field, this GPP has now morphed into the specific sport that they're competing in. And so now you've kind of moved CrossFit up one rung. It's not GPP anymore. Now it's sport. And so you have to fill that bottom layer with a bunch of other stuff that you weren't supposed to do in the first place because it wasn't part of CrossFit per se. And some people have a hard time with that, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's there are a lot of people in the CrossFit space, and maybe all spaces, like political space, religious space, who are very emotionally tied to what their experience with the thing did for them. So CrossFit did save a lot of people's lives, and like got addicts out of unhealthy behaviors. It took obese people and got them out. But so they're so tied to the word CrossFit that they'll defend it at all costs without really thinking about, well, okay, your experience inside of an affiliate with, losing weight or finding your community or whatever is not really the same as somebody else's, who might be a 17-year-old kid that looked up to a role model in the CrossFit Games and then got into an online program where they're smashing themselves with volume that they haven't prepared for, tear both their labrums and get hurt. It's like, we're not criticizing it to stop the good stuff from happening. We're trying to use best practices to avoid that bad stuff from happening. And without a more clear, honest discussion about the positives, the negatives, what can happen if you overuse training or overload the same movements over and over again at that volume, I think we create a disservice to the market of future people that get into CrossFit. And it's just a weird thing because the experts in the CrossFit space are technically the people that are also employed by the business with the name CrossFit. So it's like, well, you can't really be open-minded and challenge your own ideology because you'll get fired from your job. So you have to walk the party line instead of having an honest thought about something. And that's something I experienced in my own business. I tried to create a culture of open-mindedness. But I know that my employees, if I'm paying their salaries, are always going to be careful about what they say to me because I'm paying them. So it's an interesting problem. I don't know if I have a solution to it, but I guess I perceive my purpose in the space to help challenge people to think more deeply about how we can use this to evolve the sport for the better, evolve the training methods for the better, upgrade the education of the affiliates. Like, a lot of people don't talk about this, but a lot of the affiliates don't make profitable earnings year over year. And people get burnt out because their business infrastructures are not great, but also their competence as coaches is very low. It's like, okay, well, your total net experience of education is maybe a level 1, 2 or 3 certifications you took that are also from CrossFit. And then you've coached in a class with regular people for 2 or 3 years. That's not really like the equivalent of somebody that got a law degree and has been practicing law for 4 years in the public market, that has had to read hundreds of books and gone through education and been challenged. And that doesn't really happen in our industry. And I don't know, I think it's a problem. It's part of the reason why I'm willing to go out there and kind of like poke the bears, right? Like, find the people that matter and say, okay, have you thought about this? Or what do you think about this?
I guess at the grassroots level, I do see a general mounting interest of coaches in the CrossFit space for outside information, right? You talked about CrossFit and their curricula. How do you say curriculum plural?
Plural? I don't know. I think curriculum. It might be one of those words that's both singular and plural, maybe.
Okay, let's bank on that. So that there is that incentive to go. That you can do that. Well, no, then you can't listen to me unless you can multitask. I couldn't do that. We'll leave that on the side. Yeah, there is that incentive now to go out, and because they see that, hey, there's maybe more to be gained, and maybe we can add to what we do with outside influences, which, like you said, is interesting, because in the early days, it was so counterculture, counter movement. And now, for competitors, I find myself talking to coaches about, hey, you have to think about periodization. You can't just throw random stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Now you have a competitive season. Someone needs to be in top shape either for the open, the quarters, the semis, or the games, and maybe one other instance in the year. And you have to think around that. And this is how you have, and it's like, oh, so that's the stuff that they were thinking about in like the 30s in Russia. I'm like, yeah, like this, now that we've come back into like sport, there's nothing different than the other sports. We have to think like, like SNC coaches, for lack of a better term, and we have to plan that way.
Yeah. And if like, let's just say, for example, if weightlifting stays a huge part of the sport, which we need to call into question if it's going to, like last year at the CrossFit Games, there was very little barbell, and especially like I think the clean and jerks, or the jerks off the rack in the running event. And then I don't know if there was anything else heavy in terms of snatch and clean and jerk. But in the past, most people would have that as a major weakness. It was like, hey, if you can't snatch 225 as a man, or 100 kilos as a man, or let's say like 70 kilos or 75 kilos as a woman, you're probably not going to be able to be like an RX level competitor. You're probably going to get capped in like the third barbell of open style workouts. So people needed to get better at that. And the first place they went was to weightlifting coaches. And then they got weightlifting technique and weightlifting programming. It's like, okay, well, is that CrossFit or is it not CrossFit? Because the way that people would say constantly varied functional movements, high intensity, I'm like, all right, well, that's functional movements, but it's planned variance. Like, you're going through a very strategic percentages, decrease in percentages, number of reps, time of when the top level thing is. And almost all of the volume is low intensity. You might hit above 93% of your 1 rep max snatch 3 times in a 12-week training cycle or something like that, or maybe in a high volume one once a week. A Bulgarian one maybe might be different, but they were also using a lot of anabolics. So I think it changes. But that, it just kept calling into question. I'm like, man, the people that are excelling the most at CrossFit, like who are driving the capacity of the philosophy, are training in such stark contrast to what's being presented as the periodization and programming concepts from HQ. And I'm like, that's an issue that we should resolve as a community. So that way we can bring weightlifting coaches in, we can bring powerlifting coaches in, we can bring top level experts from different fields to start talking about, like I've been quasi doing research on this for a decade to try to figure out like, well, why is Travis able to do a Metcon at max effort and then rest for 5 minutes and do it again at the same speed? Whereas if I did that the next day, I'm like ruined. Every muscle in my body is sore. I can't get up. Like, is the physiology that like what he's physiologically experiencing different than me? Is it a genetic and hormonal thing? Does that mean that there's people that are wired at a lower level that would respond better to something like a traditional CrossFit program like Trav might than I might? And like if somebody's obese and anabolic, might they respond better to weights and low intensity stuff? And if you bring all of that stuff under the CrossFit umbrella, now you have scalability to the world. But if you keep it as this niche, like go as hard as you can until you throw up type idea that a lot of people that aren't educated in the space have, you turn a lot of people off and you can hurt a lot of people, or you give them such a traumatic first training experience that they'll never walk back in again. It's like going to a jiu-jitsu gym and getting like cross-faced and smashed and choked out on your first day. People are like, oh, I'm never doing that again. So I don't know. I'm just a huge advocate that we push education and farther development on the next generation.
That brings me to the little exchange that you had with Dave Castro. I've been watching Dave's week in review videos over the last few weeks, and it's been good. And I saw your name in one of his titles, and I wasn't exactly sure what he was addressing, but you then replied with a lengthy comment, as you might, with your detailed thoughts on the matter. Where did that start off of? Because it's a topic that's really interesting to me. This idea of intensity, I guess, control and volume distribution for competitors in the space, or for regular people that want to be healthy and fit. Where did this exchange start off of?
Yeah, so we've been organizing our own education for the last, I started with a mentorship program 2 years ago. We did another one last year. And then from those things, I was like, all right, well, I need to make a body of courses first. So that way, when I mentor people, we're on the same language about training. So I'm in the process of building a movement course, a strength course, a conditioning course, and then a programming for functional fitness course. And every night I sit on my computer and I'm organizing the curriculum and getting my ideas down and taking all the statistics I have from athletes. And I happened to pull up a Instagram, and Dave Castro posted a workout that he did that had like swimming and deadlifts in it. And he said, didn't use that left my stopwatch at home, didn't use a stopwatch, just moved. And I was like, huh, that's really interesting, because that to me is not high intensity. You're just basically now at that point, you're just exercising. You're not really doing CrossFit according to how I have understood what people communicate to me what CrossFit is. Yeah. To me, it is CrossFit. I think that still falls under the body, but I was curious to hear how he would defend the perspective if somebody called him out. And I didn't really expect that he would comment on it or even respond. But I made the post. Then a ton of people commented on that comment. And then he sent me a DM. We went back and forth. And I was like, hey, we should get on a call. Like, we don't need to do it as a podcast. I'd love to like connect, hear what you think, see if there's something that I can do to help with the education, or see what the initiatives are, if there's anything that TTT could do to provide value in the industry. And he said, yeah, sure, I love that. I never heard anything back from that. I tried to schedule something, never heard anything back. And then a week later, I saw my name go up on a YouTube video, and I was like, oh, shit. But I listened to it, and my first impression after hearing it was like, oh, man, the tone kind of gets lost when you're making a comment on Instagram, because he said, like, in it, Max El-Hag asked, like, is this even is this even CrossFit? And he said it with almost like me saying it in a snarky way, like I was coming at him. And I was really, honestly, genuinely curious if he would classify that as a CrossFit based workout or not. So I went through answering basically the question, or explaining why I answered the question in the first place. And then it led to another response, and kind of was a bigger thing than I anticipated it being. But it was just really like a comment at the end of the day, because I've been thinking so much about how do you take all of these ideas from the movement culture, gymnastics culture, strength and conditioning, human sociology, like all of the things that I've been learning for the last decade, and try to make it simple enough that an entry-level coach can come into it and have something practical to take away. So that way on day one, they're a more effective coach. That's my goal. And I think of CrossFit Level 1 as a similar thing. And there are some things that from my personal experience, that haven't been upgraded, given that it were 10 years between the two times that I took the Level 1, and there was almost no difference in the information. I'm like, man, that's weird. Like, I'm a low level company in comparison to that. And we've already turned over our education 4 times.
But that's why.
I guess
That's exactly why. Titanic goes straight into the iceberg because it's too heavy to turn, but we're small and nimble enough that we get to, like, I do a seminar, I'm changing like at least 5 to 10 slides for the following weekend because I figured out a bunch of stuff by talking to people that it has to be updated. And I think I guess it's one of the downside. We don't have all the infrastructure that they might, but we do have the agility to actually update our thinking. And like you said, that's important because we should update the way that we think in our model. New information comes in along the way.
Well, they have too. That's the thing. Like when you talk to people that have been there for 10 years, they're not doing the same things that they were doing before. They're not going into workouts with the same level of enthusiasm that when they were 23 or 25 and first got hired to be a red shirt. Like, they're all training differently, and they all talk about the nuance. And Chris Spieler has come out and said that CrossFit for Sport is different than CrossFit. So I'm like, well, what? Can't you just add a 2-hour part of the Level 1 that just talks about the nuance? Like, you don't even need to change anything. Just say like, hey, these are some of the things that over the last 10 years are like, or create a continuing education piece that you have to watch before you go to the Level 1. Like, I think there are ways around it. And I wouldn't accept that it's too big to change, because if it's too big to change, I feel like then the education will fail itself, right? Like if you're not building good coaches that can run good businesses, how long are affiliates going to stay in business or keep paying for their affiliations? I think that you're only going to have success going to new markets that haven't experienced it yet.
One thing that came out of, or that I noticed in your comment is you highlighting the importance and the role that plays low intensity training, whether it's for competitive athletes or just people trying to use the philosophy to be in good shape. Can you talk about this a little bit? Because it's kind of a surprise to a lot of athletes and coaches that I talk to in CrossFit. I'm in Europe, I'm in Switzerland. I speak to a lot of coaches in France and in the French speaking market, let's say. And it comes to a big surprise to many of them that low intensity actually has its place, especially for competitors, and that it's not going to have a negative. There's always this interference fear of like, oh, but if I do cardio, then all my gains are going to go away. I'm just going to like shrink away, and I'm not going to be able to perform. Can you talk to that a bit? Because I feel like that's probably one of the biggest myths still amongst competitors and coaches.
Yeah. Well, first, I want to discuss non-competitive athletes. I would argue that they're not really able to be intense in the first place, because in order to be intense, you need to work on that same skill enough over time to develop the competence and the cardiovascular endurance and the respiratory capabilities to be intense and get an intense stimulus. So I think even like average members of CrossFitters that are doing CrossFit are not really doing that much intensity work. Even if it feels intense to them, their physiology is not such that they can elicit a super high level of power. And power really is kind of a proxy for intensity. Like, how much work can you do over how much time? So for regular people, it might not be as important to give them the idea that they have to go low intensity. But once you start getting to that athletic level where you're higher, it's mandatory. Like, no one is training like the CrossFit Games 365 days of the year. You would be broken so quickly. Generally, the only people that are doing it are like young aspiring athletes that don't yet have good guidance. Like, they're just like, well, this is what they do on TV, so I'm going to do that all the time. But if you go and look through their training programs, if you add all the volume they do of warming up or cooling down, even just that, 15 minutes on the bike before and after 3 to 4 workouts a day, you're already talking about accumulating somewhere between 90 and 120 minutes of low intensity cyclical training, just based on how their normal training behaviors go. If you add in all the low percentage work of their lifting, all the accessory work that they do, their distribution of how much of the stuff would classically be called CrossFit is probably like 20%. Now,
So
there are some. Go ahead, finish. Follow-up question.
I was going to say it starts looking awfully. It starts to look an awful lot like an intensity distribution you would find in like a 5K runners program, or a cyclist program, just any endurance sport. Because at the end of the day, if you're doing 1, 2, or 3 full days or 4 or 5 full days of competition, you're performing in an endurance sport.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is an endurance sport. I think here though, it's more important to be careful. Like in a 5K. If somebody's overdoing 5K running and longer duration stuff, it's still all long. It's still all long and like lower-ish intensity. In this, if people are dropping the hammer in all their 1RMs, in all the stuff that's like sub 3 minutes long and super high power, and going extra hard and intense in the long stuff, you're talking about real health issues, not like, oh, you're getting slightly overreached or overtraining. You're talking about like complete hormonal meltdown. And I've seen it. I've worked with people that have come on board whose testosterone levels, even though they're jacked and super fit and look great and they're influential people in humanity, you're like, you're dead inside. You have nothing left hormonally because all you did was kill yourself in the gym. Some of them underfeeding as well, which compounds the problem. So for me, there's like a real moral imperative to share the information, because I've seen what happens to people if they don't at least think about how often they're doing to themselves what they're doing to themselves. And there's people out there at a high level that are super talented that are doing 2 or 3 Metcons a day and telling other people like, oh, you could just do it all the time and not periodize. And I'm like, yeah, but are you really going at your games level threshold intensity in those Metcons when you're doing them? Like, or are you like operating at 85 or 90%, maybe you're 30 seconds slower in training and then you're dropping the hammer? Like, that nuance is important to share with somebody who's untrained or inexperienced.
Yeah, you talked about the hormonal levels. I've been able to test a lot of CrossFitters on the physiological side of things, and like you said, it's funny because we say Metcon for metabolic conditioning. It's in the pyramid. It's it's above nutrition, if I'm not mistaken, and we've equated metabolic conditioning with WOD with beat down, but metabolically, most of the CrossFitters that I've tested, they have like. They have let's put it the nice way. Let's say they have so much room for improvement. Like they haven't even started their metabolic development from a physiological standpoint, because like you said, all they've done they've dropped the hammer. One interesting tweet that I've seen from Alan Cousins recently, who's an endurance coach, renowned endurance coach, is kind of 3 overlaid pyramids of different qualities and how fast you can progress in time. And obviously VO2 max, zone 5, high intensity stuff is the fastest to increase, but it's also the first one to peak. And then you have to kind of shift gears and go to longer stuff. And you'll talk to pro cyclists and they'll say, I've been in this sport forever, and my VO2 max, my threshold, those things haven't changed in like 5-10 years. However, my durability, my resistance to fatigue, my recovery, those things I'm able to keep progressing over time. But it's hard because at first, like you said, people aren't powerful enough to actually damage themselves so they can do high intensity and get the benefits from it until they reach that plateau, and now they start hurting themselves, and that's the time to shift gears and do something different. But it's not necessarily part of the conversation yet.
Yeah, and it gives the illusion of progress. It's like, okay, well, if you took somebody, like I've seen a lot of endurance athletes that got into CrossFit and they're like, oh, I'm hitting PRs on all my 5K stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was CrossFit itself that gave you the success. You built a base of very low intensity training. You may never have peaked those top level zone 5 systems. Now you're doing a bunch of training that encourages you to drop that hammer and create that peak ceiling. Then you hit your PRs. So if we zoom back, you need that whole time frame to look at, well, what's making the progress. So you could say if you're looking on a short enough time scale, oh, CrossFit's working. But if you're then not going away from that intensity, rebuilding the bases of those, maybe like your strength system, you can't really rush those strength gains. You got to progressively load it, like month after month, year after year. You need to be on strength cycles. And if you don't do that, you just stop getting better. And sometimes you create regression because you injure people, or not you, but they get injured, or they create hormonal burnout. And when you get that deep into it, it's hard to come out of. It's a long process to get somebody back to health if they've done that to themselves.
So where do you think this conversation needs to go, and how can we as a collective make a positive impact on the community on that front? What message would you like to see be communicated more on in regards to that intensity management, volume management, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the message really just circles back to critical thinking and education. I think I look at one of my missions in creating Training Think Tank was to professionalize coaching as an industry, because I was discouraged from getting into the fitness industry and was encouraged to use my mind to make money in finance and business and go to law school and do things that people that were more successful in school were encouraged to do so you could make more money. But I felt that I was so passionate about training. I was so passionate about sports, and I loved that type of process of working with people and helping them achieve and helping them work through things, or seeing how good somebody felt when they lost body fat and liked the way that they looked in the mirror. But there's no real professional infrastructure to develop that. If you go to school for exercise science, at least in the States, it's hard to get a really good paying job. You have to get like an underpinning job inside of, an institution like a school, and you're barely getting paid, and people get burnt out from that. So I think that we need to critically think about how much education is required to properly coach humans. And that includes like all the biomechanical stuff, all of the human stuff, all of the sociological stuff. Like CrossFit's super successful because people have a community of other people to do it with and hold them accountable. So like that's got to be part of the discussion. And I think simplifying things the way that the level 1 did, and making it a low barrier to entry and letting the cream rise to the top, was a great move in the beginning when when CrossFit needed to scale. But now it's scaled, and now each new person that potentially comes on board, if they're really uneducated and they hurt people, or they overtrain people, or they don't give people good information, every single person that goes to that gym now has a negative association with the word CrossFit and with the training of CrossFit that negatively impacts people like you, or people like me, or people that are at the top level that have put decades into trying to understand how to do this well. So I honestly think if we don't do that, it's going to create some long-term growth issues, or an exit of the CrossFit community from some of the best people, which we've seen in the past. You've seen a lot of people that got into CrossFit, loved it, started educating, and then was like, this is doing too much damage. I'm going to go out and just teach people like, how to move better.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but like you said, it's a bit on if we take a business analogy, what allows you to scale to 10 employees, you're not going to be able to use the same means to scale to 1,000. And like you said, now that there's that depth of the CrossFit space and all the years of practice, like you said, the cream has risen to the top. But like you said, if you come down at the bottom, that pulls everything, like the whole system gets kind of pulled and held back almost because of unfortunately, if there's people that are negatively impacted by the discipline, or by a faulty application of the philosophy, that's really unfortunate. Yeah. Did you want to finish, or are we good?
No, that was it. I was just playing with this.
Good. Keep going. I want to switch. We have a few minutes left. I want to switch to talk about the competitive CrossFit season. You guys had a fantastic podcast. I think it was a 2-hour podcast where you kind of critically thought, as you were mentioning here, about the whole season. Let's get directly to the Cole's notes from your perspective. ideally, in your mind, what should change in the CrossFit competitive season to make it better, and why?
Oh man, that's a big question. I wasn't prepared for that.
One of those surprise ones I didn't tell you
Yeah,
about,
yeah. I think clarity would be the number one, or
Mm,
transparency from headquarters and how the sport's going to be governed. Like, for example, Adrian Bosman, I think, looking at the programming, did a better job of testing according to the philosophy than Dave Castro did in the 10 previous years. Now, did that make a positive move in the direction of the viewership of the sport? I don't know. I think maybe it was a step back because there was a lot of watching our best and brightest fail on the competition floor, or looking at the frustration of athletes that there was inequity built into the test. It's like, how can you have a fitness test and then have a longer lane and a shorter lane and then have all this education on the importance of being able to measure power and make things repeatable? I'm like, you're just throwing away scientific principles that are really embedded in your methodology by testing improperly. So I think there were some major issues, and a lot of that I think can be solved with transparency, which it seems like they're doing more of now. So
mm.
they might already be on the path, and I might not have anything of value to add to it, but it would be really nice if we understood who's influencing this thing. What coaches, what judges, what athletes, what people inside of HQ, how is the decision-making process being done? Like, every other professional sport has infrastructure, and there is forced lack of secrecy. There's judges councils, there's players councils. In CrossFit now, it's like, all right, well, there's a players association, but from my outside opinion, it seems like they don't get to say shit that matters. And now there's an internal council of athletes inside of HQ that's also employed by HQ. I'm like, well, it's a bit of a conflict of interest. So I would vote for transparency. Like, let's share who's in charge, what are they in charge of, what's happening, how are coaches valued in this process, how are athletes valued in this process, how are we going to fix the judging standards, how are we going to fix the unfairness of the unknown and unknowable, because it's a cool concept in the ideology, but when you apply it to sport, if there's not real honesty in that process and people are getting like hints about what's coming out, it really changes things. If I could have had Travis and Noah practice cross under double unders for 3 weeks leading in because they knew, they wouldn't have looked stupid doing them, or even given them, like, I got exposed as a coach. I gave them 0 legless pegboard climbs, 0 in training. And that happens every year at CrossFit. Like, we can only pick so many things to structure progressions and training, and there's always going to be gaps. So when it happens, you're just kind of like, hey, this is part of the sport. There's nobody out there that's getting it perfect every year. But if somebody did know and they got 2 weeks of practice, it would have been no big deal. And like, Noah failed halfway up his second pegboard and got stuck up there. That wouldn't have happened. And you're talking about that could have potentially been thousands of dollars into his thing. And I know there's athletes out there that are getting this kind of unfair advantage because of the way the system is structured. So if I had to narrow it down to one, it would just be transparency. Like, tell us what's happening,
Yeah.
why it's happening, how it's being governed, who are the decision makers, who's in power, who we speak to if there's unfair things, how athlete issues are handled, just the whole thing being above board, as opposed to like secretive the way that the initial CrossFit operated for the previous 10 years under the different administration.
I'm glad you mentioned the unknown unknowable, because that's really, I feel like you said, it's great on paper, right? The original philosophy, the Hopper concept, all those things are great, but then when you apply them in the competition, and like you said, some people are gonna know. I mean, people talk, and that's just the nature of things. You've mentioned that multiple times on your podcast. You've had a wind of things through other people that you shouldn't have been privy to. So it would make it so much simpler if a few weeks before we knew the movements, the standards, you're going to be tested on those things. And then, yeah, everybody is on the same, on a level playing field, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And if you wanted to test that philosophy of unknown and unknowable, I think there are creative ways to do it, like separate it from the CrossFit Games and have one off-season competition that they never test athletes with, and one person is in charge of creating just the ultimate test of adaptability. Like, call it a test of adaptability as opposed to the test of fitness. Be like, all right, none of you guys practice any of this shit, or if you did, it was by accident. Like, we got archery in here, juggling, handstand walking, obstacle courses that you've never seen. Like, I think that could be cool in that context to see, well, how do the best athletes in the world try to do this? But when you're talking about doing it for the CrossFit Games, I think you cause more problems than you solve. That's just my opinion.
If we talk about constantly varied, there is in competition now, there's a set list of movements like we saw this year. There's a few variations that can be thrown in that can disrupt kind of the preparation, but there's you're going to see a thruster, you're going to see some barbells, you're probably going to see some dumbbells hanging from a bar doing something with it. Can we truly call it constantly varied, or should we just accept that, hey, no, the sport of CrossFit has those different movement categories, and you are going to be tested on a subset of those? Should CrossFit, in your opinion, take that direction?
I mean, I think they should. I don't know if
for the sport,
will,
for the sport, I guess,
yeah,
not the philosophy.
Again, I think you could tie it back, to the education. If in the level 1, they said the sport is different than the ideology, here are the differences, I think you could solve it all right there. Then you don't have to say the sport is constantly varied. You say, hey, because of a pragmatic issue of trying to make a cool sport that's visible and have people prepare for it properly, here's how we break the sport down, and here's how we go from that constant varied ideology into a structured degree of variation that allows us to express the ideology a little bit, but we know that can't really happen in the real world because people would show up and look like bums on TV, which doesn't really inspire other people to watch it. So it circles back to critical thinking, education, separation of the sport. But I would love if they did that. And I think people would too. It's hard for athletes that aren't making it to the CrossFit Games. It can be really hard to dedicate a whole year of training to show up to the next season and have 5 completely different tests that put you lower on the leaderboard. And I'm like, all right, well, if we really look at this, like, you have really long arms, and this year there was a strict handstand push-up test, a muscle-up test, and a handstand walking test, and you have poor levers for all those. But in the year before, there was none of that. So you were better in that year. You could be more fit now, but their test isn't really a good test of fitness. They just call it a good test of fitness. And then it makes people that are participants be like, fuck this. I think it causes a lot of problems from my experience, from the people that I've worked with in the community.
Kind of goes back to what James was trying to do with his competition, and standardize some of the aspects of it and have measurable progress that could be established from year to year, like you say, because as you've even mentioned in your on your channel, on your podcast, you take a test from, like, I don't know, you take 17.3 or whatever and you redo it, but it's not the same standards, it's not the same distances, it's not like there was the rum rope climb or something like that. You change
the
one parameter.
This year they were moving the pylons. I'm like, well, that changes the whole test. How are we comparing scores? Like, every transition is different than it was in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's okay. So better communication, more transparency, so that everybody can know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and be on a level playing field. That makes quite a bit of sense.
And because like the functional fitness, or whatever it's called, the PFAA. No, not the PFAA. What's James's competition called? IF3.
Is that his now?
Or
I remember the OPT. Was it OPT or was it OPEX already? Yeah, this one. Yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
Oh yeah, there's the optathlon. I think they actually somebody had just reached out to me. I think there's an actual competition called IF3 that he was involved in creating with that same idea. But
I didn't know he was involved. Yeah, because it's definitely here in Europe. I know some of the athletes I work with have partaken in that. Yeah, are they following a similar idea?
I think so. I think it's similar. I don't know exactly, but the problems are, if it's too structured and regimented, it can be boring to watch. And if you don't have the best athletes in the world, it's definitely less to watch. So it needs funding. right? Like that's the only way that you're going to be able to get something like that. So I think CrossFit is in the unique position that they hold. It's almost like they have a monopoly on the power of how it's created. And I don't know, that's just seems to be an issue right now.
Something I want to finish with. I know we have a couple minutes left here, Max. A recent post that you put up on your Instagram, Atlas with 3 T's. Can you talk a little bit more about what this is or what it's going towards?
Yeah. So training think tank as a concept was, it was more than CrossFit for me when I started it. My background was in wrestling and some Brazilian jiu-jitsu and bodybuilding. And I've always had a desire to help the public market understand their own physicality and how to manipulate it. And I also had a desire to help athletes in all different realms. So our kind of long-term vision with Training Think Tank is to turn what is traditionally in the market right now thought of as Training Think Tank and kind of rebrand it into TTT CrossFit. And over time, start to expand to the things that I'm kind of passionate about. So the first two would be golf. I do that recreationally with 2 of my coaches, and I'm working with somebody right now who's trying to make it to the PGA Tour. His name's Blaine Barber. And I have always been involved in martial arts in some capacity, whether it was wrestling or Brazilian jiu-jitsu or Nogi jiu-jitsu or kickboxing. So that image was kind of the first thing to be the TTT martial arts, to teach people some of the basics of combat and how those things could be beneficial to you, which I think, like, to me, that now falls under the umbrella of CrossFit, but it wouldn't be if you talk to most people. Like, most people aren't balancing on one leg and trying to kick and develop splits or roll on the ground and bend themselves and fold themselves. But I think some of those concepts could be applied to their movement training to avoid them getting injured over the long term. Like, it can make a more robust human. So that's kind of one of my long-term projects. That was the image that one of our coaches drew for me as a starting logo.
It's a good one. I like it, and I guess we'll follow that project as it comes along. Max, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come back on the podcast. It was a blast as always, and I guess I'll talk to you soon.
All right, brother. I appreciate it.
To this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.